Okay, let me start sharing my screen. And so where do I want this? Better. Oh, that's Chris.
Hi.
Very dark, Chris. Gothic.
I know. It's like if I turn the light on, it's too bright.
Well, take some bulbs out and turn on the lights.
What I need is, well, I can't. It's like these horrible overhead things. I need a proper backlight.
Put your
I could do an avatar.
Put your cell phone on.
Yeah, I'm down on. Oh no, it's not down on batteries. Here, let's try it. Let's see if this works.
On. There, that's better. That's better.
Yeah. I can't see anything now. How about under there?
I can't see everyone's face. Maybe there's a way to do that. Can I have people's faces while I'm actually presenting? Okay. No big deal. Do we have everyone? Not that we should wait any longer. We should just get going. But
and today's the 20th of December.
Today is the what? Oh, where you are, right?
Yes. Yes, where I am.
Time is relative. All right.
So
I'll get into it. So I have been dabbling in this area for a while. When the query issue came up a few weeks ago, probably, I think Brian brought it up. He suggested that we look at replacing the query function and features that are in Ren-C today. And they're pretty limited. I had been a lot more ambitious in what I was trying to do with query. So what I quickly did was I grabbed a bunch of pieces out of my more ambitious shambolic script and pieced it together for a little prototype so we would have something to discuss here today. So let's just real quick, just to review what query is about. Everyone here knows. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but basically query just returns some of the metadata information for certain resources, a port, a file, or a URL. It's not really very useful just to have it so narrow, because a lot of the time what you want is the actual contents. You're not necessarily interested in just the labeling on something. And in fact, if you look at just what is available from the query feature of on a file, it's like 4 fields. So over here on the right, for example, and we're going to focus mostly on file munging today, because I didn't have a whole lot of time to try to work out some of the issues with URL. It will still work with URL, but there's very little to no data to work with. Most web servers, either for security reasons or for some other reason, are returning back an object that's mostly blank. But if you look on the right here, we only have 4 fields to work with. At least this is on Windows, and I don't know if it changes from OS to OS, but on Windows, you got name, size, date, and type. That's not that helpful. And even there, if I go back, if you look at the date, it's got that format, which is, I guess, the universal time format. So that's also not that great for this. What you would typically want if you were using a rich or robust SQL dialect is you'd be able to say on a given column, you could format things in your select statement. We'll get into that in a minute or two.
Sorry, why is that date none, and then there's date again? There's a real date. The headers have a date, but the other one doesn't have a date.
It's what's coming back from the server. So the date of the headers can be different than probably what's returned from the higher up in the HTTP. I don't know. That's just what comes back. This is an old query, so I changed the date to say February 2020, I think. Yeah, so it's an older date, but I don't know exactly. And within the HTTP header, there can be custom fields and things like that. I think Chris is on here, and Graham, you've written ports and stuff, so you know that this header object can contain a lot of stuff. I think this is fairly standard from what comes back, but you can get all kinds of other stuff on this too, depending on what's returned in the port. So as I mentioned earlier, I pulled together a quick little demo, and I just went back to the basics with query, and I said, well, I'll just pull out some functions and some routines that will work based on what I've used in the past, and I'm really just going to apply this select syntax for now to the legacy query function. And what that does, it just provides a kind of a file search. And still here, now in my more ambitious kind of scripts, I do not limit myself to the metadata. What I want, I want the metadata, of course, but I also want the actual contents of the file. But for this, we're just going to stick to the basic metadata fields for file and for URL. I'm also not flipping the order around of any of the SQL. It's pretty basic, select from where, and then you can also have limit as well if you want to cap the total number of results, which is pretty helpful since it's very greedy. And when you do write an SQL statement, it's going to return everything that matches and in the case of your hard drive, of course, that could be your entire hard drive. So you'll almost always want to cap that off by limiting the result set. Yeah, it is not difficult to switch it around so that you can start with a from or flip around a select and a where. But for this, I said, I'd rather just sort of keep it simple for now. And these are kind of for one-liners anyway. It's not really a big deal to start with select anyway. I did include things like wildcard matching and globbing or globing. So we do have some bracket expansion, brace expansions, which is a nice little feature. And what comes back is a list of results. So it's not really that exciting. Here, let me just show you. Am I able to bring that up here? I'm going to stop sharing from here and start sharing from.
So are you saying that you can do grep-like things within the Ren-C then on files?
Yeah, I have lost the meeting. I don't get any of the controls right now for the Google Meeting here, so that's just not helping me.
What do you mean the controls?
So I was sharing my screen and I had the meeting up, and now I don't have any.
If you move your mouse around the moving your mouse around the screen makes it pop off the bottom for me.
I think what you've done is you've stopped sharing, so you need to start sharing again. Because if we're seeing all of us here, you're not sharing anymore. You must have cancelled the sharing.
Yeah. Well, I was just mentioning that if you see like 4 people and you don't have any controls except like a little time and a count of people and a message box thing up in the corner, if that's what you're seeing. For me, when I see that,
I found it.
If I move the mouse around, it pops up.
I'm sorry, I found it. It was just buried in a bunch of tabs, so that's my fault. Hold on a second. I'll be right there. So. All right. So down at the bottom of the screen, I just loaded the script in here. Here's an example. I just sort of overrode the word query with an exclamation point. This is just some standard SQL statement. The clean star, of course, is, give me all of the fields. In this case, there's only 4 since we're searching a file data type. I'm setting it, I'm using a where comparison, a filter, so everything that's greater than, let's do something a little bit more interesting, and limiting to 50. I get 50 results back. This is just whatever is on my desktop here. I can also go deep here. This is not really that great. Let me pull this up. If I want to make it deep, I can just say anywhere in the from area here, I can say deep, and it'll do a
recursive
recursive directory search. I can also say, if I want, I can say and name, like, let's do, I just want MP3s, and let's say, this might take a while to run to, and MP3,
isn't percent used
T, and PDF. So, I mean, also, well, it's grabbing anything that meets those things. So all my tunes from my car, thumb drive, a bunch of TXT files. You can see this is pretty not pretty. I mean, all it's doing is spitting out the result set. I do have access, and I provide these numbers here. What comes back is block, and if I want, BLK, I can get through the numbers. Is a convenient way if I wanted to pick something out of the result list. What else is interesting? So let's do something. I don't know what's going to come back in some of these. So let's do like something version, and this will be, how about a number? So let's do 0 to 15. And so this is just going to find any file that has, has VER 0, 1, 2, 3 to 15 dot anything else. I don't really know what's going to come back here, but it just could be interesting. Oop, and I just crashed Rebol for some reason.
Great file bug report. File a bug report.
I have noticed in the latest version, Brian, that quite a number of things, I get the assertion fail in things that I have.
Assertions are very, that's because of the debug build, and assertions are very picky. So it may not need to crash, but it will.
I wanted to use the newer version just to try to take advantage of some things, and also, just get more familiar with, report any of the issues that might come out of that. Anyway, it does need more error handling and stuff like that, as you can tell. But globbing and, brace expansion, so you can A to Z, uppercase or lowercase, 0 to whatever number you want. And any string of character, and then of course things like the asterisk or the question mark. Let me go back to sharing my screen. I can come back to that in a minute. I just have to reload the script.
Just a question: doesn't SQL use a percent sign as a wildcard?
It does. It uses an underscore and a percent sign. I didn't implement those, but it's trivial to do that. They're very limited. And non-standard. I would say that the other things like wildcards and even the brace expansion is more standard than what SQL uses. But we can support both of them. And in fact, we can also because it's a dialect, right? We can put whatever we want in there. So we can.
So you can select on a range of dates for your file creation.
We can also, we can do dates, and we can also, if we want, just say instead of, we can stick anything we want in the clause and say something like, we could say match if we wanted, or rule. So we could say where name matches, and then just write a parse rule if we want. Because that's the beauty of a dialect. You can just kind of stick in there whatever you want, as long as you want to support that. So it's pretty cool. And anyway, back to the main topic here. What I did was basically just take a select, the select syntax and apply it toward file munging. And there's a lot more that can be done around that. But I wanted to make sure we were sort of on the same page in terms of what we were looking for with regard to replacing the current query. Current query is a type of thing that is really just opening up a port on a resource and getting the metadata back. And what I just demoed is not exactly that. It's really more of a file munging and a file wrangling or a URL wrangling dialect. So it's more akin to search than it is to the more basic function of just sniffing the metadata off of an asset or a resource. So I just want to, I'll turn it back to the group for a second, and if you can, do we agree? Is that something? Do we want to have this kind of searching functionality in it, or are we really looking more to replace? Sort of, the function that we have today, basically. And would it look like something like OS query or some of the, the database type searching that we've discussed in the past, or is, roughly what I just showed you, is that sort of on the right track or not? I mean,
well, obviously, I mean, we need to in order to get these fields out of files, like what date they were created. File name presents a problem. Chris has brought this up, where there's the file name you use to open the file with, and then there's the file name that the actual file has in the file system. The canonized name of what the user saved it under. How do we get that name? And that's hard to get. The funny thing is that, like, if you've opened a file, you really do pretty much have to ask for the directory list and then find the file again, because there's not really a generic cross-platform way to get the canon name on a case-insensitive file system, which both Mac OS and Windows are. I think that idea that there is some sort of that you have a schema, that you have fields that that you can get, and being able to sub-select those. The idea that you want to be able to sort of let the decision about how much information has to be pulled and then filtered be made by some middleware, if you would, that can decide, do I have to read the whole directory and then filter it down, or can I ask the OS to give me everything that matches this pattern and to be more efficient? And so being able to phrase your query in a way that middleware can make that decision on your behalf. But there's a lot of design to that, and a lot of,
that sounds pretty, that doesn't sound very simple. That sounds very deeply technical.
Yeah. Well, I just think there are layers to this. I think one layer, the kind of, I mentioned how in my post I talked about how there's a sort of free form, Englishy, you can type whatever you want, whatever order you want, and then that has to be broken down into levels of understanding where it's like, okay, we've figured out what that free form text meant, and we've done any pre-processing that we can do, and then now we're going to call something that's more structured, that takes these parameters, and then that kind of works down. I think that we don't, since we don't really have any of those layers, it's good to define any one of them. And I said that question about, do we words, for variables, how do we denote variables in the dialect? And those dialect questions, I think, are good to answer. So it seems like a genuinely useful tool because I know, none of us really like using the command line grep or awk or sed or whatever tools that are on the system. They all suck. And so we'd like to see something better. And it would be nice if instead of having to reach for regex, if you're going to do file name pattern matching, you give it a block, it's a parse rule. So yeah, I think that, that schema, getting at the inner schema and what's the, how do we publish these schemas or there's a lot of design to do there. And the question is, do we want a dialect like this to be the sort of generalized parse-like unified query dialect for all things that are like this? And I think that we do. So yes, to answer your question, yes, we do want something like that. But a lot of the work for what query is going to need to be is going to be work on that schema.
Yeah, see, the script that I'm using is it's using query. That's what I'm using to read off the those metadata fields, those properties, those file properties.
Well, I feel like because query is just a monolith, like give me, it had one parameter that wasn't even heeded. I mentioned that in the post. It's like there was a concept that you could just ask for one property if you knew the name of it, and it would just calculate that without having to calculate all the other things. But that didn't work. So it didn't do anything. So it would always just give you the same object. And even if you could just say, there's this one object, defined for all ports for all time, give me just one field out of it. That isn't necessarily what you would want. So, yeah. So my post kind of laid out, pretty much the state of understanding as I have it of what we need to worry about. And I see here you said, you say where size is greater than 0 and name, and so your keywords and your field names are words, and so you got to kind of ask like how's that going to do when when size is a keyword, or what if where? I mean, where is a good example, because it's the kind of word you might use to label a location. Where could be a city, and it goes, incident. Where did it happen? Las Vegas. So where is greater? Where equals Las Vegas. And is that sane, or does there need to be some sort of concept of what field names look like? So
this is definitely a type of dialect which is I describe as a keyword dialect, which is basically like declarative, and it's like a command language. So you're going to have reserved words in it. You can set it up. I think we had discussed at one point using quoting or something for the fields, which we can support also. But it is smart enough to handle most of those things. You can, it's going to parse it based on clause, parsing one clause at a time. A select field looks a certain way and has, I can say the specific names. It can handle those things, and if you introduce something that is not a recognized field for that for that from source, right, then it will come back and say, not recognized, or the select does not match the from.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah,
we can use commas now, can't we? We can still use commas.
We can use what, Graham?
Commas.
Comma.
Yeah, we can use commas. Actually, I stopped using them this week when I was developing on this because it seemed, I'm not sure, something happened when I was using it once, and I'm like, well, I think I shouldn't use the comma because it didn't seem like it was working, and I didn't really have time to figure out why. But yeah, we could use commas. I don't know yet how I would parse those in every comma would be like a keyword within dialect, I suppose, right? I would have to declare that, right? So, or I would pre-process the words that are coming in and just ditch, pull out all commas that are, so. But
it would be a literal, wouldn't it? An optional literal, something like this.
Yeah, a comma is a value, so it would have to be accounted for in the way you parse the dialect. But anyway, it's certainly that can be overcome for sure. We can include commas, I'm sure, like we can any value.
So why don't you put it up as a user library, like we have other user libraries, and we can play with it and we can give you feedback.
Yeah. Okay.
You know about the user libraries?
I don't know about the libraries exactly.
So where are they? They're in the Ren. I think the GitHub Ren direct folder. Let's have a look.
We can put up anything. I like everything to have its own, GitHub project. It doesn't really matter where it is.
The user library is an index into.
Yeah, the index. Yeah,
it's
right.
an index, yeah. So you can have your own projects or whatever you like, but it's just an index into the libraries.
Okay.
So let me just see if I can find the link. So it'll be a user utilities or user module. But here's one here. I'll just paste it into here. Paste it into the chat here somehow. Chat there.
So basically, just if I'll continue this. I don't want to eat up all of our time tonight because I'm sure we want to get to some other things. But the rest of the deck really just touches on exactly how all this works. I don't think for the group here, this would be very simple for you guys. I'm basically just inverting a for each body, which is very simple to do in Rebol. Basically, you're just taking the body part and you're using that as your expression, and just inverting the way it's sort of like a list comprehension. So if you look at something like Python, they have list comprehensions where you have the expression and then you iterate across it. Ren-C, it's not really maybe a map would be closer to a list comprehension. But in any sense, it's not very difficult to invert things around in order to have Rebol blocks work exactly like SQL or Python. I haven't looked at, I know Scala and Haskell and other languages have list comprehensions as well. But this is sort of a way to create a dialect which acts as an interface into a list comprehension. And basically, the typical file wrangling kind of pattern that I use, and I've used thousands of times at my work, it's about usually it's around 20 to 30 lines of code, which isn't very long, but it is custom code that someone would be writing that I can distill into a SQL query that fits on a single line, really, and you can write very naturally with knowing very little Rebol, if any at all. So that's kind of the idea. And today I just wanted to get some feedback on the general direction and figure out if this type of feature and functionality is really mapping to what we were talking about. I mean, I'm not really looking at inventing the lower level functionality of query, which involves accessing these the file system basically at a low level in order to read the metadata contents. I'm more interested in the user mode stuff where basically we're able to scan very quickly either a URL for relevant fields or headers and HTTP fields, but also the content fields themselves, which means you can search for arbitrary tags and arbitrary, open and close tags. And then also on the file system to be able to access not only the 4 fields available through the query, the metadata, but the content themselves. So I wanted to get your feedback on that higher level stuff. And then, obviously, basically, if you look at the code that I have today, I kind of pulled it together from, another source. And it needs a lot of cleaning. It really smells like a key. The code almost has, code smells like a cheese shop. I got to test some things. I know on my work laptop, there are security protected folders that I'm unable or haven't been able to figure out how to properly trap those types of errors. And that's a problem. This also currently uses a recursive scan for file systems, and on very large file systems, of course, that can be, you could run out of memory. So that's a potential issue that we might want to figure out.
If you run your code as an administrator, can't you get?
Excuse me?
If you run your code, your Rebol instance as administrator, why can't you get access to those secure folders?
It's my work. I don't know. This is my work laptop, which means I don't have admin privileges.
Okay, all right.
So anyway, that's an example of just where I've run into, I've gotten errors that I've almost never seen before. So something comes back from, if I hit those, like, for example, Windows directories. I also am right now, I'm providing access to a simple block of all the selected fields. But I'm not adorning that in any way or decorating it in any way. It's just a simple block. It would be nice potentially to also have a way to format that block for, not essential, of course, but sometimes it's nice to have the block sort of render properly within your screen. I'd like to also test it in replpad, which I haven't gotten around to doing that yet. That would be interesting to see. I'd like to be able to scan other URLs and also scan the DOM of a browser. At that point, probably another follow-up would be good, I think. And if we feel pretty good about where things are for just creating, select statements where we're just reading and doing innocent things like that, then I'd be comfortable then also going into the other aspects, such as insert, update, delete. Explain and describe, I think, are also really important. Explain and describe are both SQL functions or keywords that will tell you what the resource is like. If it's a table, it would be, how many columns there are and what the columns are and what the specifications are of a given column. So I would want to translate something like that for whatever the data source is in the front clause. So explain the file system or explain the directories that are being scanned, that sort of thing.
Ed, how familiar are you with schemes?
With schemes?
Yes.
I'm not very familiar with schemes.
Because that is the easiest place to go about implementing things on a kind of per domain basis, I guess, whether it's file system or like I built like a sandbox scheme. It was just kind of a wrapper on the file scheme for my Rebol 2 project, and I was able to, like, you can put on in Rebol 2 you could do read custom, and you have a little block afterwards. Mm-hmm. And in Rebol 2 you could use that to, Graham, I think you'd set up something so you could write to like web pages or set web servers.
Sure.
But that block is custom. So I mean, one of the things I did on this custom file scheme was just put in a little it took a little parse rule and just for directories under this thing, it just kind of removed everything that didn't match that parse rule. So like schemes basically.
Yeah, that's what this does too. By the way, when you select anything, first of all, if anything's wild, anything wild is, wild cards or globbing, that's all done with a like keyword, which tells the system to translate that into Rebol rules. And all that gets put into a rule hopper, which is what the filter is. So anything in the where clause goes into a single sort of, has to be true or false, basically. So either I'm parsing something if it's a rule, or it's something that has to return true or false. Yeah.
So you have just like in any scheme, it's like you have all those. Have a list of actors somewhere, and obviously read doesn't have custom anymore, but you can use any of the other Rebol words. The one I'm thinking of off the top of my head here would be select. Like the directory scheme doesn't use select. So you could almost, I'm not quite sure how to do this in the directory scheme because the actors are kind of in a native object, but it wouldn't be too hard to conceive where you just kind of like hacked select and you could almost instantly sort of have your dialect working on directories instead of having the monolith. It's in the scheme. It's not in your function. It's in the scheme. So you write the way that your dialect works for that scheme, for this scheme here, and you just put it in there.
Yeah, maybe we could talk more about it. I think.
You're kind of. It sounds like you're kind of talking about the mechanisms of the middleware I was talking about, like how, and I think that I looked at OS query. I built it, and I looked into, if you, Chris, did you ever take a look at OS query to see if you haven't looked at OS query, you probably should. It's pretty deep, and it does let you really use SQL queries across everything, and they created a sort of a abstraction plug-in architecture for adding new schemas, and they do all kinds of. You can even turn it on, and it will real-time log, and you can make queries over time windows if you turn it on as a real-time monitor. So it hooks the file system at levels that programs can't sneak past it. They can't, just show up and then disappear. So it's a logging tool, but you don't have to use it like that. You can use it kind of like how Ed's doing here, where it just queries the current state, whatever it sees, and then whatever it misses, it misses.
Mine is very high level. I think maybe it's 200 lines of code. I mean, it's not. This is not a big script.
So what OS? When you think about abstracting to asking processes for their process ID and how much memory they're using, and then you have that same thing to query your, all of your S3 folders, and so it can do all the, they actually build the Amazon Web Services tool into it or something, it's this giant monolith where they've compiled every possible protocol into it to talk to things with the SQL. And I think there's stuff to learn from that.
It would be a dream for me to basically be able to load this in replpad and be able to, scan and do like file munging across my S3 buckets, for example.
Sure. So that I think it would be good to study that. So I did start a study of that, and then of course something else comes up, and I chased that shiny thing for a little while. But yeah, I'll just mention that looking more at OS query I think is important. What I'd like people to really do is to really scrutinize this question of what makes a dialect, because the thing that I keep running into and feeling is like, what is a dialect? Like, how do you make it, and how do you what are parentheses? In this dialect, what does it mean? And that question of when your location is called where, or from, how does that relationship between a quoted word and contextual positioning, how is that taken care of? And so if people really study those questions, which I think haven't gotten the study they need, considering that's like the central thesis of the Rebol idea, is that, you know, to walk that line and to help people when they have a new task know what the best practices are. So yeah, so that, yeah, it's good to see it running, and if you can publish it, that's good, because then we can ask these, you know, these questions.
I think that I would see a great deal of use for it if it could also search within the text as well, do a contains, because when
that's the way I use it. Actually, I dialed it down just for this
because when I used to, you know, file bug reports or whatever, I used to search through the Ren-C code, and it was really painful because I had to use Linux tools. I had to put it onto a Linux folder so I could use search or grep, whatever, because you can't search on the GitHub repository because it's not the parent repository. And it was a real pain because I'd have to look it up each time how to use search or grep or whatever. So, you know, if I had a Rebol tool, then I would use it. So, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I use this at work for hundreds of things, basically, variations of this. So, yeah, it's just very, very useful. And of course, it's really stunted in a way to not be accessing the actual payload of the contents. That's where, you know, basically you want to go deep, have access to the top layer of metadata, but be able to go, you know, and search and manipulate contents of files, you know, in the file itself at that level.
Okay, thanks very much. Now mine is just a 5-minute demonstration because there weren't enough people volunteering. So anyway, as you know, you can't present on top.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying happy 2021.
Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you know I really dislike doing manual things, and I hate repetitive work. And so occasionally I work for companies, locum companies, and they ask me to fill timesheets in. And you know, this is. Can you see my screen yet? Anyway, so this is. Oh, it's coming up now. So you know, I even hate filling in the hours that I work. I mean, they should be able to read that. But anyway, this is the timesheet that they sent me, right? So it's a PDF, and it actually is a smart PDF, so you can actually fill in there, and I can put my start hours and my finish hours, right? And then they don't actually ask me to add up all the hours because I get paid for a day regardless of whether I work at 9 or 10 or 12 o'clock, whatever. But if I start at 1 o'clock, then they say, well, it's a half day. Then I have to put my signature down here. Then I have to send it. I have to send it off for someone to sign it. I have to put my name in this field here. I have to put the hospital I'm working in and my role and the week ending, which means I have to go to the calendar and see what is the week, what is the Sunday that represents this week. So this is all pretty tedious. It sounds easy, but it's tedious. So anyway, what I thought, well, this is a PDF. I could do what I did before and template this as a PDF. But then I thought, oh no, Ren-C doesn't have a GUI. I can't do that. So anyway, I looked at alternatives, and what I did notice that I could actually turn this PDF into a Docx. So this is a Docx, Word document. And what I did was I created a template, and I put my name as a name there, week ending, position, hospital. And these are the start and finish times, and they don't ask me to add up all the hours. So these are just template holders in my Docx. Now, I then found a JavaScript library, which is called Docx PPTX generation, which allows me to take a Docx in JavaScript and do variable substitutions as well as other things. So I then went to, let me see now. So then, where is my code? So here is my code here, right? So this is just called timesheet, Reb, whatever it is. So this is what it does. It basically, first of all, it downloads a lot of these libraries, JavaScript libraries that I need. Okay, there's 4 of them. So that's the template one. Then there's a zip thing that needs to be done, and that's something to allow you to save a file from JavaScript onto your local file system. And then there's
We have that. It's called download. If you just type download, you can.
Okay, and then I have to put this function, these zip utilities, into the DOM so I can access it. So I called it load file. Okay, so that's now available in the DOM. And then I have a little function that allows me to input something and get an answer back, and just does a little bit of error checking on it. And here's my little function that does calculates what the end of what the current week ending date is, based on what today's date is. And then I have another question which asks me, input what the current. Just check, make sure it's the correct date, and and then I calculate all these things. So it says, well, if today's Monday, then I started work at 8 o'clock and I finished work at 5 o'clock. If there's no Monday entered in, then we have nothing there. We just substitute null, and it goes on like that. So then I had this function here which then loads up my template from Amazon S3, and then it zips it up, and then it loads the zip into this Docx template, and then set data does a substitution. Now I think that uses what does it do?
Reword.
It uses reword somewhere. It should be, looks like reword. Can't see it right now. Anyway, so it substitutes all those words, and then it creates it gives me the new Docx, and I download it, and I'm happy. Okay, so here's the reword. Oh, it's reduce. Oh, it must be a reword anyway. There it is, reword down the bottom there. Okay, so let me just show you it in action. So there is the replpad, and I'll just do on that. Let me just do the script. And it said, well, okay, yep, week ends this date. Yes, that's okay. I worked Monday and Tuesday, and maybe I worked Friday as well. And then it downloads. So it's 3. And then I go to my Docx. For some reason this is doing that, but I don't know. We'll just open it up. And there it's put in my name, the hospital I'm working at, my role, the week ending, and it puts the times in. And then all I need to do is print it off as a PDF or whatever, send it off to be signed. And the amount of work I've done now is I hit enter once, and then I put 3-4 characters in, and that's it. So that is my time-saving device. Because I hate doing repetitive work.
Yeah, well.
And that was using the craft, eh?
Well, I guess the question is, the time spent, and does it actually ultimately save time? There's an XKCD about that. It's like time spent
to save an hour or something.
Time spent automating a task.
You see, these are skills learnt on using JavaScript integration with WASM, Rebol WASM. So it's not totally wasted.
Yeah, okay. It's definitely useful.
Right. Anyway,
it's good. Yeah, cool.
Okay, that's my 5-minute spiel.
Yay! All right, I don't have much, but I do have something. So let me see if I can a tab. I don't know how to do this. Where is it? And the tab I want to show doesn't show up here. Great.
Is that an old dog you've got there, Ed? He's walking very slowly.
Yeah. She is old.
This looks about 10 years old or something.
Yeah, maybe even older.
Really? Need some anti-arthritis gels on its legs.
Okay, does that work? Can you see it?
Yeah.
So I was doing a little messing around with schemes. So I replaced the read like I was suggesting. So I have this on my local drive here. So now read will work on that. As it did before. So this is the same as it was before. You can read HTTP. But in restoring the old read and installing schemes, I've been able to add a couple more schemes like the storage ones. So you can do, all right. And that is persistent. You can reload. And it's still going to be there. So that uses local storage.
Is
there a notification that it changes that you can register to a hook like in another tab so it could know when a storage changes? Do you know? If you
I was looking briefly into the whole storage API, and there's not a lot to it. I mean, you probably could, because the storage API it's linked to some kind of JavaScript map. So if there's some way of tracking those changes, then you can, I guess,
inter-tab communication.
Yeah.
So where's it?
The storage is like tied to that domain or whatever, right?
It's tied to that domain. You can only read and write it if you are in that specific domain in the same browser.
Which is localhost?
It's just I'm running it's effectively localhost. I mean, there's like a limitation of 5 megabytes that you can save your files to. I don't have it as a binary, so I need to figure out how to do that, because you're sending it to JavaScript, which doesn't have binary, so you have to kind of figure out how to do that translation to and from.
So this is like cookies, is it?
Doesn't it? I think, isn't there like a blob? I mean, I thought there was a blob API that I'd expose at some point where you could get a blob out of a binary. Maybe I didn't do that.
Chris, is this like
cookies? As far as I can, sorry.
Is this like cookies?
Yes, but you don't send it over the.
No, but you could send it. You could send it. So you could store it locally on using this API. So next time you go to a website, you could bring up your cookies, because cookies are stored in web browsers, but they're not stored in Rebol.
Right.
So you could bring up these bits of data and use them as your generate cookies to access data.
Yep.
Well, I like that.
Okay, so there's this. So I hooked up. So I did just a kind of like a very cursory replacement file scheme. So you can also do this, and that should now. That should now work too. Again, doesn't work with binary yet, but it's the principle's the same.
Yeah, interestingly enough, Emscripten has a number of layers in it that you can compile against, where if you have written your code to run against the POSIX file system or whatever, it will do these kinds of emulations. So we could compile in the POSIX support and then go through that layer to get this kind of functionality. I think these sorts of ideas are better. We'd rather. There's no reason to go through that middleman, considering the fact that the port code's just not any good to start with. So it's better for us to be coding directly to what the offerings are. So we're not only not wasting the sort of circuitous, performance that could, introduce failures in these emulations and take up space, and then also go through crappy code, but also to have the full exposure of all the features that you could get to from JavaScript. So yeah, I think that's something like this is a better idea than using Mscripton's POSIX file system emulation on top of a local storage, for instance.
I mean, there's two practical benefits. One is you can demonstrate the file scheme in the web browser if this works properly, and two, if you're building an application with this, you can use that as that virtual file system too. So it's not like a toy. It's useful, but you're limited to 5 megabytes. Seeing if I've got an example. So I mean, this is the source of the scheme. It's really not that. It's really not that much to it. It's like I have a little JavaScript wrapper, storage get and storage set, and that's it. What else?
As long as you're here, could you just type help on download? So you can, if you just say just download, just type download and then quote hello or whatever.
Like that?
Like that. Oop. Uh-oh. Well, maybe it doesn't work anymore. We should fix it. But
file name.
Well, yeah. Try put between download and hello. Something .text. But I don't think that's the problem. Yeah, it looks like it's got something else wrong. I was just going to say that I'll fix it. Whatever's wrong with it. One thing that could be wrong with it, maybe. Again, it's also running on your local host, so we don't really know what things that's doing. But that's what you can use to download things when it works, Graham, is just to be able to download files.
So I actually just did this just to demonstrate how this how you can kind of customize schemes. So this is the directory scheme.
So download is to download to your file system. I was actually fetching it to load it into a JavaScript library.
Oh, you mean download from? Download from AWS to a local an in JavaScript memory.
A function needed to have a document, and so the function was being fed the URL to get the document.
Well, so there's a little demonstration of how you could hook up select. So this is just a function that returns this block, but you could customize that however you want to. So that's how you can hook into the existing schemes, like a query dialect.
That's called select. Yeah.
I don't see any reason why select should have to make a port for files and URLs, because you're not selecting anything else from. Oh, you're not selecting any data from the string file or the string URL.
Yeah, that's these things are big questions of the polymorphism of the language and how far that should be pushed.
Insert change maybe, and insert change, or they may still need to access the string, but select I think is you're not selecting anything from the string itself.
This is a whole separate topic, which is how these sort of generic actions might be thought of relating to query. So let's put that as a discussion point. How do the fundamental verbs of Rebol compete with what you might think this query language does, and are they the means of implementation, or do they complement it? Or they compete with it? What's the deal there? So.
When you're writing a dialect, though, you're handling the words in the block. You're not evaluating them. So, you can have whatever you want in there and mimic, you can overlap as much as you want with Rebol. Not that that's in your interest to do so, but it's all just data in the block for any dialect. So there's not really any restriction there. At least I haven't run into any problems with it, as long as you're not executing a select, outside of the context of your dialect. So in your dialect, you can have select mean one thing, and it's completely different outside of the dialect, which is fine. Your dialect should match whatever the domain is, really, ideally. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, vid was always very confusing to people who didn't realize that vid was a dialect.
Yeah, so in the SQL dialect, obviously, there's lots of overlap, but I mean the word select, of course, but it doesn't change what select means outside of the dialect.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, that's what I've been playing with.
I'm glad you got a chance to mess some with the integration there. It's pretty powerful. I think it's the fact that it works and it works as well as it does. I think it's pretty cool. The little libRebol API packs a lot of punch. I think when you look at it, that mixture of how it mixes together the strings and the little escape parts that you put in, and that you can actually make those substitutions, span inside of parentheses. So it's actually running along with the scanner. As the scanner runs, it can splice these pieces in. And I mentioned all these, details about how it doesn't let you splice nulls. You always have to quote the null. That's important. All these things are important. But good to see you trying it out.
Kind of wondering if I can, does this work? Yeah, I'll see in my, so this is where I changed the replpad. Trying to say, I think, well, I think I'd asked briefly, is there an overview somewhere of the API?
The best place to read about the API is in the alib.c source file. It kind of breaks down, the comments on the functions where they are defined.
And they're somewhat consistent between JavaScript and C, if you were working with the desktop.
They are consistent. One of the biggest questions that I sort of have about it is JavaScript can do something that C can't, which is to essentially kind of have a lifetime of it can prevent crashes on stray handles. And the question of whether we take advantage of that or not, do we does what you get back when you call one of the functions that gives you a Rebol handle, do we just sort of mark that handle as expired and let the JavaScript references, we free them on the C side, but they're JavaScript objects that now are marked in JavaScript as stale. So if you use them, they'll crash or give you an error or something.
I had quite a few errors just in doing these little functions. Which way around? Where do I put the red text, the spell? I couldn't figure out how to get. I thought red value would return an evaluated version of the text, so you could store any. Yeah, I was getting errors doing that. So.
Well, yeah, you'll have to show me the specific things, but that's reb.value will run the splice, the text and the splices that you put into it. If you try to pass nulls into it, it will not work. You can't put nulls in. It doesn't just throw them out; it errors on them. So you always have to quote You have to quote any nulls. You have to quote anything. Like you have a word, the word will be evaluative. You have to think of every one of the API calls as essentially a compose. Mm-hmm. So the slots are being composed. The variables aren't words. The variables are composing in that value directly there. So if you put a word in, that word will execute unless you put a reb.q around it. That applies to nulls as well. So if you want to test it for refinement is null, you have to reb.q it. That's just sort of the way it works. But yeah.
So are we going to see this in the one that Brian's hosting?
Yeah, we'll merge it. I don't have the main thing with schemes, and Chris filed a bug or a question, I guess.
Oh, like, the file directory.
Why do the file and directory schemes have this? Why isn't file : / the same as if you read that thing as a % file? And the answer is, when you look at this, is just that the scheme stuff is really unsophisticated and underdesigned. I mean, it doesn't really have much of. But the fact is, if it's the only thing you have, it's better than nothing, because otherwise you wouldn't have any dispatch at all. So I'd like us to sort of discern the sort of legacy of, hey, this was the only way to do it. It's better than nothing, with what good is.
There's still some really kind of interesting aspects to it. Just like because you're tying the way something acts to the domain based on the URL or the file type. So I mean, there is some kind of powerful flexibility, and you're when you're actually using this in code, it doesn't, it's very becomes very intuitive. Very you don't have to remember different keywords for different domains.
We should keep the good parts, but we should also try to design it. Rebol has a lot of things that are just sort of hey, this seems like a good idea, and then none of always softballs. They sort of here's the first thing I tried, and hey, that looks kind of good, and never these really cross-cutting, challenging questions of what's the invariant, or and that's just missing, and it's the kind of thing that is very hard to do, but and then still get something nice. I mean, people who go, here's a pure invariant, and then people go, well, it's unusable, So we got to look for that happy medium. So hopefully we can do that with the schemes. But yeah, bringing schemes into the web browser version is a good way to make them relevant, and also to let us play with a lot of established code cheaply, like you show with the storage. It's a better playground than trying to compile against. It's more relevant, number one, currently, and it's a lot easier than trying to get down in the C level and call all these obscure, esoteric, platform-specific APIs. You can really study. You get functionality out of it, and you can study the actual scheme design. So that's good.
The other, I guess, left my head. There was another question I had, and it's completely gone. Oh, crap. Yeah.
So Brian, are you going to do a wrap up end of year video or talk or?
I'm gonna do a post. I think this is we're gonna do our holidays here, and I'll compose a post to sort of summarize things. I mean, I didn't do a whole lot this week besides watch YouTube. Kind of thinking, and I'm a little bit. I feel like on the one hand, you can say we're sort of seeing the limits of the medium, that it probably doesn't get too much fancier than it is. And I wrote that post on virtual binding, just this question of, can we do something? I was bothered by the idea, right, that you would make a function and you make an object and it has a bunch of set words in it that are unrelated to to being locals. You're declaring an object that you're going to pass somewhere, and then all those set words become locals, and that was annoying. That was annoying enough that Shizhen had done that. He had made a function and he put some giant object in it, and he had exceeded the limit for the number of locals that you could have in a function somehow, or because it had made a local in that frame for everything. And then you have that same problem if you put a function inside of a function, that any of its locals become locals of the outer function. And that's just bad. And so I've wanted to have solutions to those kinds of problems, and hoped that I would come up with something interesting. I posted this thing about
has that always been the case?
So what?
Has that always been the case where the locals of an inner function become the locals of an outer?
Well, it's been the case ever since that function that looked for set words and decided all set words were locals existed, but that isn't the original. So the original was you had to explicitly say what your locals were in the definition of the function. And that may be about the best Rebol has. It may not be a medium that has much better. I did kind of, I've come up with a couple of potential ideas, but then there's also questions of how to avoid so much copying of if you have a for loop that has some variables, it has to copy and rebind the body. And then if that has another for loop inside it, has to copy and rebind that body, and has to do that for every outer and for every inner. It's just, there's some very hard to accept foundational limits of how this medium works. And I don't really know what I've been trying for a while. I fixed some fundamental things that were annoying and made them good, but it may be at the limit. And so the paradox there is that means that everything is just sort of finishing something that is limited, and you kind of know where its limits are, which doesn't feel very fun.
Well, I think Carl solved that by saying that Rebol's only for programming in the small.
Yeah, well, it's probably true. So, yeah, I kind of, there's this big question of well, what else is out there? So I do spend time looking at other languages, learning Rust or whatnot, and wondering what the contribution of this is. And I think that the interesting thing is trying to look at other projects. I definitely see that there is this missing space. That Bash is still pretty hard to grasp, and you're not going to see the next generation of web tools hopefully based on Bash. You might. So I think that one of the big things that I want to kind of get at is what's the domain of application, and if we're going to make it useful, or is it just a game? And for me, sometimes I think it might just be good for games.
Yeah, I get a little frustrated when I hear that, just because that's what it is to some people, but it's not I don't know, it's in the eye of the beholder. So it's kind of it's good for you. If you see it as good for your games, that's great. There's applications I know I can build with it if it worked for me, and it doesn't.
We need to focus on I make things work pretty fast if they can be made working. Yeah. So
I guess the other question, the thing that I'd forgotten was just events, JavaScript events, and passing how to pass the events to what the best practice for handing events off to Ren-C in the browser is.
I haven't really done anything with it yet. It's coming in from JavaScript, so JavaScript gets the event. So then the question is, what are you going to call? Right now, you can't call, is because of the single, just due to the whole nature of the single threadedness of it. You can't synchronously call into the evaluator if it's suspended. So events are always either waking up you can do one of two things. You can wake up the a JS awaiter if there was a waiter that had sort of returned. When an awaiter returns, it has a body that's JavaScript. When it returns, it doesn't return a value. It doesn't return a value until the resolve function or the reject function are called. So the idea when a JS awaiter gets called is you get a resolve and a reject function that you don't tend you don't tend to call those inside the body of the JS awaiter, or you wouldn't have used the JS awaiter. You just use the JS native because you're going to return a value. But you get those two functions and you pass them off to JavaScript, and then you give it to a timer. You could say set timeout, and then you give it that resolve function. Gets bound in its body because it's a closure, and so then when that timer gets called, it calls resolve, and then your function returns.
So how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
I guess how would you do that from? I guess what I don't understand like the big picture of what's happening. So you bring in your compiled code, and it runs, and then it goes through and tries to run any kind of Rebol scripts that are in there. But what is it exactly? Is it kind of like is it just like an object that sits there in like JavaScript? Like it does
the whole process is really, honestly, I comment code better, I think, than pretty much just about anybody, except for to the extent that they drift a little bit out of date. But if you read the comments to the actual load R3.js, if you read the comments in the replpad boot process, you will find paragraph after paragraph explaining what every part does. And yeah, it does. It spins up. It basically the whole of the evaluator is run in a sort of a promise, and you can read about that. It's been a while since I've messed with it, but the idea is that it these JavaScript async functions are what the JS awaiter is based on. And that's just the idea of putting the evaluator into a suspended state of animation while JavaScript can free run any code. The DOM can refresh. You do anything, and then it calls the resolve function from the JS awaiter. So we set you up in a situation where you have complete synchronous control. Browser will not update. DOM events will not, if you just sat there in a while loop, if your program sat there in a while loop, you'd have no response. It would just hang, right? So the only way that you're going to see anything other than hang is for you to write a special kind of function, not a JS native, which is a body of JavaScript code, which returns a value, just like anything else. You write a JS awaiter. When you write a JS awaiter, there are two functions in the body, two names, so instead of return, you have resolve and reject, and they're functions. And during that, you return out of the JS awaiter, and Rebol will wait while the main loop of the browser runs. And it's waiting for that resolve function to be called or that reject function to be called. So you tie that wherever you put that. You can put that resolve function as the callback that goes on a button. You can put that resolve function in a callback for when you hit enter in editing the command line. And when you do, it will make that the result of that JS awaiter function call that you made. So ask text or whatever. Ask is an awaiter that interacts with some JavaScript GUI code. It's all JavaScript stuff to do the interactivity. And then when it's done, when it's ready, it calls resolve. And that call to resolve will cause that ask function then at that point to return.
So you're still looking at this from the point of view that you're executing Rebol code. in the browser. So, like, could you bring it in as like a brain? Let's just say it's a brain that's sitting there. It's a Rebol brain, and you're doing stuff in JavaScript.
Mhm.
Is that like an easier concept where you're doing stuff in JavaScript and the JavaScript goes off and says, "Hey, brain, process this and come back"?
Yeah.
I mean, would that be an easier way to?
It's a different. I have a post, sort of historical post, where I talk about the different ways in which you can think of it. And you can go back and read that post for my remarks on that. Yeah, I think that's not as the idea of having a Rebol services component where you can be writing a big JavaScript program and then occasionally call it to parse or whatever. If someone finds that useful, you can do that.
I would find that useful. Yeah.
The replpad doesn't do that.
Right.
It's the other way around. But yeah, you can just load the library and then just make those calls. In fact, to do that, you don't really even need the JavaScript module, because the JavaScript module is for providing the JS natives and things like that. So that's for you to call. Calling Rebol from JavaScript is provided just by virtue of being compiled as JavaScript.
So Rebol is just another JavaScript function sitting in the DOM.
Go ahead. What about the DOM? Repeat.
I mean, Rebol exists as a JavaScript function.
Or object.
Sitting in the DOM. And you can call it.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of entry points to a library.
Yeah.
It's all those functions: the reb value, the reb text, the reb binary, rebelide. That's what you get. Those are the sort of wrapped. WebAssembly only takes numeric numbers. WebAssembly doesn't have data types for functions. It only takes numbers, and so if you have something like a JavaScript string, you have to find a way to proxy that into this big array of memory, the WebAssembly heap. You have to put the bytes in a location, and then you have to remember what location you put it as a number, and you pass that to the WebAssembly routine. And so all those wrappers, the reb, they call variadic functions, they pack up things, they do all kinds of work. But that is fundamentally what you get out of the libr3.js. So the replpad and the GUI JS and all that sort of infrastructure that turns it around to put Rebol in control is because I think that's the more interesting domain. Personally, I kind of agree with that, but I have some ideas that I want to try in the other direction. Sure, and the best. I'll point you at the alib that sort of explains the whole library methodology, because that's the best place to document it, is right there on the definitions of the functions.
No, that works for me. I'll do that. I know where it is. I know where alib is. So I just wasn't sure if you'd if there was any other writing on it.
No, just the general high-level stuff in the forum. Administratively, the whole thing about void naming and stuff needs some votes on that. If you feel, I don't know if you have any feelings on if that is settled by making elide and such void functions. I'm okay with that. But then we need a new name for this bad word. So.
Okay, so this is the end of the video series meeting this year, I guess, and I guess we'll meet again in January sometime.
All right.
What is 2 weeks?
Hey?
2 weeks. What is 2 weeks? 2 weeks is the second, right? Or no? No. 2 weeks is 2 weeks is the second, right?
Well, we have to give Ed time to finish his query dialect for us.
So I say 3 weeks then, or
so 3 weeks. Does that sound good? I mean, 3 weeks sounds like a standard holiday.
Yeah, we'll reconvene after. I'll try to write something up to kind of summarize things that happened and things that I think are going to happen, things I think won't happen. But yeah, I'm glad, Chris. I'm glad you got a bit into the web REPL thing. I think it is the most interesting artifact that we have right now, and the most interesting angle. I really don't know what Red is doing. It still baffles me. They're very, very detail oriented on things like the DPI on GTK, and I'm like,
well, aren't we going to get some big update?
We're going to find out if they have this massive audience who really want to write those kinds of programs and want to not only want to write those kinds of programs, but want to write them in Red. And I kind of wonder if they found the only people on the planet who fit into that category.
Shall I ask Doc Kimball to give us a presentation?
Yeah. But
go for it.
I think the web angle is, that is somewhere where we're not seeing, just looking around and seeing stuff like the Pyodide, putting the scientific computation in the browser with Python and all that. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting to think about what they think the vision is, and then all the languages that aren't really caring about that are going to die, I think.
My take is until you can start like flinging the DOM around, and like I know that Brian did that, the GUI builder, but I need to look at it again, but it wasn't quite clear to me how you use that practically. So, it's like, how do you start building the interfaces that were kind of relatively straightforward to do, even if Vue had its limitations? So some things are relatively easy and quick to do.
The problem is that there's a great lag.
If you can think of what the source level dialect should be, then I don't really think it matters how much JavaScript is behind it.
Well, the key is events. I mean, it's events are the events and how you map the objects, the DOM objects to Rebol. I mean, are you just like using JavaScript wrappers, or is there some way that you can kind of like smartly represent those objects within the brain?
Yeah.
And the events are like, need those.
Right. Well, we can talk more about it. I guess we'll go ahead and go. All right. I'm gonna run, but
Yes.
thanks. Looks good. Good stuff.
Merry Christmas.
Well,
Happy
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and stay away from COVID-19.
Yeah.
And if you're in the Northeast, stay warm because
Stay positive and test negative.
All right.